Hey guys, it's Tosh. Today's lesson is about sentencing and corrections. So we're going to talk about what happens to somebody after they've been found guilty of an offense and some of the different options that judges have in passing sentences. In Canada, juries are able to make findings of fact, so they can determine whether an accused is guilty or not guilty, but the sentencing is done only by judges, and that's one of the differences between Canada and the United States. In the US, sometimes juries are allowed to make recommendations about sentencing. That's not the case here. I want to say up front, I've put a bunch of cartoons in this PowerPoint. I'm not going to address them as I narrate this presentation. I'll let you go back and look at them in your own time and appreciate them in your own way. So let's start with the lightest possible sentence that you could get if you were found guilty of a minor offense. This would be appropriate in a case where somebody has never been in trouble with the law before. This is their first offense. And just the process, and I'm sure you can empathize with this, just the process of being arrested and fingerprinted and photographed and taken to the police station, having to go to court, all of those are really scary, intimidating things. And for a lot of people, just going through that process is terrifying enough. And so if a judge has a person in front of them that fits that description, they may decide to let them go with an absolute discharge and just a verbal warning. That is an option in a lot of cases. There are other light sentences like suspension of privilege, and maybe it isn't entirely light, but sometimes you'll have judges revoke someone's driver's license or firearms license or fishing license, and that suspension can be for a specified period of time. And so, you know, that again is a sentence that's appropriate for minor offenses or driving-related offenses. I'll skip that. Another thing that is often used is giving somebody a fine, setting an amount of money that they have to pay, either back to their victim or just into the court system in general. This can only happen if the judge is convinced that the offender has the ability to pay. And the maximum fine for a minor offense is $2,000. It can be used as a sentence, but only for offenses that have a minimum sentence of imprisonment and a maximum of less than 2 years. So, you know, you don't fine somebody for committing murder, right? These are for, again, smaller offenses. Now, I should say here, it used to be the case that on top of a fine, there was also something called a victim offender surcharge. And this was imposed on top of the fine, sometimes $100 or $200, and that money was used to pay into a fund that victims of crime can access. But a few years ago, the Supreme Court found that really those victim offender surcharges only served to keep people who were in poverty to be even more in poverty. And they actually ruled that the fines were cruel and unusual punishment, and contrary to Section 12 of the Charter. You can look up that decision if you want. It's interesting to read. There's another cartoon for you. This is from one of my favorite series of cartoons. Okay, let's talk about conditional discharge. It is exactly what you think it is. Somebody is discharged, but there are conditions. So those might include not possessing weapons, observing a curfew, staying away from their victim, attending counseling, abstaining from alcohol or drugs. And what distinguishes this from something I'll talk about later called a conditional sentence is that the criminal record is erased after 3 years. So, you know, they may be sentenced to a conditional discharge, but if they observe all of those conditions and they're of good behavior for 3 years, then their criminal record is actually erased. So we're still talking about the low end of the range of sentences that are possible here. Again, we're talking only about minor offenses. Here's one that's often used in cases of assault, right? Some guy punches another guy. So their sentence is basically to keep the peace and be of good behavior for up to 12 months. So it's casually referred to as signing a peace bond, or it's formally referred to as binding over. And again, if the offender keeps the peace, then no criminal record gets created, as long as they get through those next 12 months without assaulting somebody again. All right. So let's talk about probation. Probation is a sentence, and a lot of people get probation and parole confused. Parole is what happens if you've gone to jail and you've been of good behavior and maybe you get out on parole early. That's totally separate. Probation is a sentence that allows somebody to live in the community under the supervision of a probation officer. And they have to check in with that probation officer on a regular basis. And it's the job of that officer, and this is a really interesting career to consider, to help that offender turn their life around and get back on track, find a stable place to live, find a job, and integrate back into society. So there are always conditions, like we saw with conditional discharge, and for some offenders, this is enough. For others, though, it's not. And one of the challenges of the probation system is that the caseload of probation officers is absolutely massive. And sometimes it's difficult for them to keep track of all of their clients that they're looking after. And so there are people who slip through the cracks, and that's an ongoing issue in our system. Here's a sentence that I think is kind of creative because it it scares the offender quite a bit when it's read out in court. So a suspended sentence is one that is like a threat hanging over someone's head. So I want you to picture, some. Oh dear, sorry, my cats are fighting. Sorry. Oh, no. Why do I have to start this all over again? I'm not going to. I'm just going to work through it. So it's a threat hanging over someone's head. Sentencing somebody, and they'll say, I'm sentencing you to 2 years in prison less a day, but I'll hold off on imposing that sentence, provided you don't break the law again. So this is for somebody that, they're not quite as straightforward as somebody for whom you'd give an absolute discharge or probation. You need to scare this person a little bit, and you need to make sure that, if they slip up even once, boom, off they go to jail. So this is sort of a medium range sentence for somebody that's kind of on the line between whether you think they can turn things around and whether maybe they need to spend some time in prison instead. And there's your next cartoon. Now, here's something that you may find very strange when I first explain it. An intermittent sentence is a sentence that's served on weekends and at night. So somebody literally goes to jail on Friday night, serves their sentence, and comes out Sunday night. Sounds weird, eh? Now, this is only possible if the sentence is less than 90 days. But I want you to consider for a second that when an offender is sentenced, there's a larger ripple effect on their family. And so if the offender is the sole breadwinner for a family, if they're married, if they have kids, and their families depend on that income, well, if they suddenly have to leave their job and go to jail, then they're going to lose that income. So this is something that is done when possible. It also helps avoid prison overcrowding and gives somebody a taste of the prison system. So should be enough to hopefully scare them and keep them on the right track. A conditional sentence is a prison term of less than 2 years that can be served in the community rather than in prison. So conditions will be much stricter than probation or a suspended sentence. So it may involve house arrest. It may involve going out and doing community service. So there's a whole bunch of conditions. So, I'm sentencing you to 18 months, but you can serve it in the community, and provided you do the following things. You may have heard about electronic monitoring. This is often used when somebody is placed under house arrest. So you can see there's an ankle bracelet. I don't know if they make them any smaller now. These pictures are kind of old. But those emit a signal and can't be taken off unless somebody has a proper key. And that signal goes back to a police station, and they monitor to see if that person is staying where they're supposed to be staying. So if they're inside the house, or if they're only allowed to leave their house to go for groceries or go to work and come back, this can help the police monitor them and make sure that they're staying in the right area. Now, a harsh sentence that can be used for somebody who is not a Canadian citizen but commits a serious criminal offense while they're here, we can deport them and send them back to their home country so that they can go on trial there. That one's not even really that funny. Never mind. So let's get to the other end of the spectrum here. Incarceration, or being sent to prison, is a total deprivation of someone's liberty. They go into an institution and they are not free to leave until their sentence is over. Now, if you look inside the criminal code, you'll see at the back of that book that there is a list of offenses, and it specifies what the maximum sentence is for each section. We saw under the Harper government, under the Conservative government, a lot of mandatory minimum sentences. And this was quite controversial, and a lot of the sentences, the mandatory minimums rather, got challenged in court. Because what they did was they said to judges, it doesn't matter what the individual circumstances of the case are. You have to, if a gun is involved, for instance, you have to sentence them to 3 years in prison. You can't reduce it and give them something lower than that. Judges often don't like those types of mandatory minimums because they like to know the individual circumstances of the offender that's in front of them. And some judges are quite good at building very creative sentences. The flip side to it, though, was that there were constantly stories of people who had committed really vicious, heinous crimes being let off quite lightly. And the Conservatives recognized that and were appealing to their base and showing that they were tough on crime by imposing these mandatory minimums, saying, we don't care what your individual circumstances are. You use a gun in the commission of an offense, you're going to jail. And, there's a strong case to be made for that. If you want to be really tough on, say, guns or drugs. It can lead to ridiculous situations, though. And I'll pause here to tell you one anecdote. Actually, let me see if I can look something up for you while we're doing that. So there was this guy. Let's go. Yeah, can't make this name up. Truly was Leroy Schmickel. Great name, and a guy who was guilty of being kind of dumb. He went to his cousin's house, or his cousin's apartment, and his cousin was actually wanted. And there was a warrant out for his arrest, and he was hanging out in his cousin's apartment. His cousin wasn't there. And he looked around the apartment and he's like, oh, look, my cousin has a gun. And so logically, he picked up the gun and took a selfie and posted it, I think, on Facebook. And unfortunately for poor Leroy, at that exact moment, the cops showed up to execute the warrant looking for his cousin. and he was found guilty of being in possession of a firearm. So he was posing in front of his web camera, and boom, in come the police. So the problem, of course, is the mandatory minimum sentence for possession of a firearm was 3 years. Well, Leroy was otherwise a law-abiding citizen, had no criminal record, and to suddenly say this person had to go to jail for 3 years was pretty harsh. So there were a number of cases where the constitutionality of these mandatory minimum sentences were challenged in court. So Leroy brought one of the cases and succeeded, because one of the judges in the Ontario court said that mandatory minimum sentences constituted cruel and unusual punishment. So one of the things that we saw in the court system was a huge spike in the number of people that were being sent to jail. And of course, constitutional challenges take a long time. So it was some time before those mandatory minimum sentences were struck down. Anyway, that's the story of Leroy. Now, when you've got an offender that has committed multiple counts of the same offense, so they've assaulted 3 different people or they've robbed 3 different stores, they can be put on trial and deal with all of those charges at once. So when an offender is convicted on multiple counts, there's 2 ways that they can serve that sentence. Those sentences, plural. So if they're convicted for, as this cartoon indicates, 5 years, it's 5 years for the first offense, 5 years for the second offense, 5 years for the third offense, and you serve them consecutively, one after the other. That's a harsh sentence. Sometimes judges will give what's called a concurrent sentence. So you're sentenced to 5 years for each offense, but you serve each of those sentences at the same time. For victims of crime, of course, this doesn't really sit well, right? If we're talking about a murder case, and you've got somebody who has murdered multiple victims, often what the families will want to see is a consecutive sentence, that they serve the full sentence for each murder. But sometimes judges feel that that's not necessary. And, if you're sentencing someone to life in prison, for instance, well, they can't serve 3 life sentences. They've only got 1 to serve. So sometimes they'll just do that as a sentence. Now, if someone is sentenced to time in jail, if their sentence is less than 2 years, they go to a provincial institution. If it's more than 2 years, they go to a federal institution called a penitentiary. So prisons generally are run by the province. Penitentiaries are run by the federal government. So here's some photos of some provincial jails. These 2 on the top are of the same institution. I want to talk about a prison that's fairly close to where we are at Cawthra, and that's Maplehurst. It's up in Milton, sometimes casually referred to as the Milton Hilton. And if you want to see a video of what it's like inside, you can take a look at that link. It's a mixture of a medium and maximum security prison. It looks like this. It's a super jail. And it's very much modeled on prisons in the United States. You can see sort of there's this central area here, but then there's several different pods. And they're set up in a circular fashion. The guards are in the middle, looking out, and the individual cells go around in a circle like that. So there's a separate center. I'm not sure if it's this area or this area that is the Vanier Center for Women, and there's also a unit for young offenders there. So if you're doing time at a provincial jail, you're just going to a provincial jail. There's not different kinds. But if you're doing 2 years or more, then there are different levels of prison, minimum, medium, and maximum security. And so what will happen is you'll spend, in Ontario, for instance, you'll spend the first, I think, 6 months at Millhaven. And here they'll assess you to find out what kind of facility is most appropriate for you. Are you a violent prisoner who frequently attacks other inmates, is hostile to guards, or are you, a quiet person and you're scared out of your mind and you're of totally good behavior and you could do your time at a minimum security facility? So what will happen is the Correctional Service of Canada will do a detailed assessment and establish a correctional plan for each prisoner that looks at what's needed for that individual. Now, this institution here has earned the nickname Guantanamo North because, this says Omar Cotter is here. He served his sentence here. He's now out of jail. You can look him up. That's a very controversial case. It holds over 400 prisoners, and that included at one time several accused terrorists and people being held on security certificates. For reasons that I don't know, there are a lot of jails in and around Kingston. So should you decide to go to Queen's University, this is just a thing that you should be aware of. If you study, criminology or law at Queen's, this provides an interesting opportunity, perhaps, for co-op placements. But one institution is called the Frontenac, and it holds about 200 prisoners. They have a variety of interesting services and programs for their clients. At one point, they operated a farm and found that teaching inmates a trade like farming was really helpful in teaching them to reintegrate back into society because they had a skill that they could use. For a time, that program was canceled, and then it was reinstated. The Collins Bay Penitentiary, which is pictured here, and sorry, a kind of blurry overhead shot here. It's got a capacity of about 700. The distinctive feature of the building is this red roof area, and so sometimes the facility is nicknamed Disneyland North because of those towers that look sort of like the Disney castle. So I want to wrap up here by saying there's a number of controversies in corrections in Canada. One of the big issues is that we have massive overrepresentation of our Indigenous people in prisons. Indigenous people make up about 2% of Canada's population, but they sometimes account for up to 19 to 20% of our prison system. So that's a problem and speaks to systemic biases and racism in the system. The other controversy that I alluded to is the whole issue of mandatory minimum sentencing, whether or not that's fair. Is it the road that we still need to be going down? Or the Liberals have been sort of relaxing on this and changing the law. But again, the voices of victims speak fairly loudly whenever there's a case and the sentence does not appear to fit the crime. Another controversy is the lack of access to meaningful mental health services for prisoners. Often being incarcerated is mentally traumatic. Sometimes people come in and they've had underlying mental health issues that really start to accelerate once they're in prison, and often there aren't enough services. Overcrowding is definitely an issue, and I think the biggest one, and this would be interesting for us to discuss or debate someday, is really what's our objective when we send someone to prison? Is our objective to punish them, or is it to rehabilitate them? Because 95% of people who go to jail in this country will get out of jail. And so if we focus exclusively on punishment, that person is re-released back into the community as a very angry, bitter person. But there are some crimes that scream out for severe punishment. And what's interesting and problematic about the prison system is that in a lot of ways, it's trying to do both. It's trying to punish and rehabilitate at the same time. And that seems very contradictory. So I want to leave you with something to think about. I can't remember where I found this quote, but it really stood out to me. That prison is absolutely the right place for some criminals, and it is absolutely the wrong place for others. So, if you do some research and dig into this a little bit, it'll be up to you to decide whether you think Canada is getting that balance correct, or whether we've swung too far out to one side or the other. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for listening. I really do want you to go through and read the textbook chapter 11 on this for more details. But this has been a quick overview of Canada's correctional system and the different types of sentences. Take care.